We're in episode 9 of our 10-part series on the book of James. And tonight we're going to focus particularly on patience. And specifically, how we can be patient in suffering. How we can be patient in suffering. And I've got to confess, I'm a little nervous about kind of opening up this conversation tonight. In kind of 30 years of preaching, I've never actually spoken on suffering, because it's a hard topic. So I hope you're feeling brave. Let's do this. Let's dive in. James chapter 5 is where we're going. James 5, verses 7 through to 12. Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. Above all, my brothers and sisters, do not swear, not by heaven or by earth or by anything else. All you need to say is a simple yes or no. Otherwise, you will be condemned. I'm going to start at the end of the passage, move on to the beginning, and leave the hardest bit to the end. In fact, all of this passage is actually pretty hard, so prepare yourselves. I want to start by looking at verse 12, the end of this passage. James has been talking about being patient in suffering. And verse 12 kind of pops out of nowhere. Above all, my brothers and sisters, do not swear, not by heaven or by earth or by anything else. All you need to say is a simple yes or no. Otherwise, you'll be condemned. And I think what James wants to say here is, in the time of suffering, we've got to keep our word. We've got to keep our word. When we say that we will do something, then we will do it. If we say yes, then it is a yes. If we say no, then it is a no. There's no three parts here. And you got me thinking, what is our word worth? Does your yes actually mean yes? Or does it mean maybe, unless they get a better offer? And will your yes stay yes if your yes costs you? Does your yes mean so little it actually needs an oath to give it weight? You know, the kind of thing we say. Yeah, I swear. Maybe you would say, pinky promise, if that's your thing. Or cross my heart and hope to die. I'm not sure if you say that here. But James says that all you need to say is a simple yes or no. Otherwise, you will be condemned. Wow. That is heavy. And that's the easy bit. But it does get better. The second point is better. James reminds us that the King is coming. The King is coming. I don't know about you, but when I was young, our Christmas practice in our family home was my sister and I would get very, very excited on Christmas Eve. And we would plague our parents saying, is Father Christmas coming? When is Father Christmas coming? Are you sure he is coming? And James in this passage wants to remind the believers that the King is coming. You know, in verse 7 it says this, "Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming." And I think often in the church we don't talk enough about the fact that Jesus is coming back. And we need to. Particularly because it gives us hope in those times when we suffer. There is hope for our future. There will be a new heaven. There will be a new earth. Christ will make all things new. You will reign forever as kings, priests, queens in a new heaven and a new earth. You'll be in a city, better than Nairobi. I know that's hard to believe, where a river of life will flow through it for the healing of the nations. And Jesus will make all things new, and he'll wipe away every tear. How good is that? And I think as we look at patient suffering, it's actually okay to be impatient about Jesus' return. The third thing I want to talk about from this passage briefly is grumbling. Grumbling. Now this I can talk about. I can run the masterclass on grumbling. I grumble about the weather, because I'm British, and that's what we do. I can grumble about potholes, I can grumble about politicians, but most of all, I can grumble about people. Because people don't do what I want, when I want, how I want. And verse 9 in the passage says this, "Don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door." So I wonder, how is your GQ, your grumbling quotient? Grumbling stopped the Egyptians from entering the promised land. I wonder if there's a promised land we don't enter on account of our grumbling. The Israelites missed out because of this. And now we're getting on to the hard bit, on to suffering. And I think suffering is one of the top questions Christians often get asked about by those who are outside the faith. Probably more questions are asked about suffering than any other. Why does a God of love allow suffering? And I don't want to give simple platitudes as we talk about this tonight. I want to try and be both really practical and really biblical, and just also recognize some of the pain of suffering. And the first thing I want to recognize is this: we all suffer. Suffering is common to man. There's no escape. It's due in part to the fall, to the fact that Adam and Eve were disobedient to the instructions of God. And that brought suffering into the world. And early in Genesis, God says there's going to be suffering in childbirth. Genesis 3:16, "I will make your pains in childbearing very severe." And the next verse goes on to say there's going to be suffering in work. "Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil, you will eat food from it all the days of your life." God's saying there's going to be suffering in childbearing and suffering in work. And a quick note for the men here: man flu does not count as suffering. Childbearing is suffering. Gents, you can start grumbling about man flu once you have given birth. Good luck with that. So each of us has suffered. Each of us are suffering. And of course, some of our suffering is our own silly fault. When I make stupid choices, I end up suffering. Cause and effect. But some of our suffering seems really random and unexpected. And it's not just the fact that we suffer. Sometimes our suffering is because of the struggles of those we care about. Early last year, my sister unexpectedly was diagnosed with cancer. The doctors discovered she had cancer of the esophagus. And the cancer had spread from the esophagus to her lymph nodes, and the doctors said it was inoperable. And they said that she had 6 to 12 months to live. And they prescribed chemotherapy and radiotherapy as a way of just delaying the inevitable. And that's meant for me, the last year and a bit has been incredibly difficult, as I've just tried to journey with my sister as she's gone through this course of treatment. And thank God she's still going. She's defying the doctors. But the journey has been hard, with many, many tears shed throughout the family. And you'll have your own story of suffering. It may involve work. It may involve lack of work. It may involve relationships or lack of relationships. It may involve health struggles. It may involve bereavement, abandonment, or more. And suffering hurts. It's unavoidable. There's no free pass here. And the reality is, while everyone in history has suffered, no one has ever suffered as you have suffered. And the most natural human response to these times of suffering is to try and avoid them as best we can. And when suffering rudely interrupts our lives, we can do our best to try and minimize its efforts. But I don't think that's an altogether biblical view, because I think God, our Father, can use suffering for his pleasure. And in times of suffering, God can often seem far off. The monk Thomas Keating wrote this: "In the dark nights, the rituals and practices that previously supported our faith and devotion fail us. Faith becomes simply belief in God's goodness. It is trusting in God without knowing whom we are trusting, because the relationship we thought we had with God has disappeared." I don't know about you, but one of the hardest things I find during times of suffering is not often the suffering itself, but the feeling that God has gone AWOL. The God who promises, "I'll never leave you, never forsake you," often seems to go missing in action. And I'm sure he doesn't. But sometimes it can feel just as if God is MIA. But the encouragement is that Jesus gets suffering. Jesus is the man who understands above all what suffering is all about. Jesus is the man who the prophet Isaiah says he is a man of sorrows, familiar with suffering. And of course, at the heart of the Christian faith is that triumph of the cross, that suffering of the cross. Jesus crucified. Jesus who doesn't stay distant from human pain, but enters it fully. Jesus, the sinless Son of God, suffered unjustly and profoundly. And his suffering was not just substitutionary, bearing the penalty of sin on our behalf, but it was also exemplary, showing us how to endure suffering with faith and love. And maybe in those times where we feel as if God has gone AWOL, it's good to remind ourselves that Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me? That feeling of the absence of God was something Jesus understood, as for a moment in time he thought his Father had gone missing. And the wonderful thing is God has not abandoned you, and he will not abandon you. And many of us ask the why question about suffering. And that's an important question. But it's not the only question, though. I think there's a second equally important lesson. And the question we need to ask is this: how does God feel about suffering? You see, I think suffering grieves God's heart. It grieves God's heart way more than it grieves your heart or my heart. In the passage we read earlier, where James is urging us to handle our suffering with patience, is at pains to write, the Lord is full of compassion and mercy. Your suffering pains Jesus. It doesn't just break your heart, it breaks his heart. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. And I think God's presence and power is especially focused on those who suffer. He's a good father, and every loving parent is quick to give care to a child in crisis. So what's the point of suffering? I don't think suffering is wasted in the Christian life. In James chapter 1, we read that God uses suffering to produce perseverance, character, hope. Suffering can be a refining fire, shaping us to become more like Jesus. And the author Tyler Staton writes this: no one chooses to suffer, and no one escapes the crucible of suffering unchanged. We do not get to choose whether we will suffer or even how we will suffer. We will only get to choose by our response if the suffering that rudely intrudes on our lives will make us more or make us less. I think, too, suffering in the kingdom is a community matter. Sometimes we think it's a noble thing to suffer in silence. You know, we can hide our struggle. We hide our pain. Because we think it's better to be brave or try and be strong or to try and be manly. But I think strength in suffering is often found best in community. Suffering's never welcome, always an intruder, but I think God can use it. I spoke earlier about my sister's cancer diagnosis. And the person who has helped me best through this, someone in church who I know well, actually a former student of mine. And she lost her mother to cancer a couple of years ago. And one of the beautiful things God's done is He has used her suffering to help me. And I'm grateful that suffering can be something we embrace in community. Again, a quote from Tyler Staton. He says this: "Losing your mother creates empathy for anyone else who has lost their mother. Experiencing miscarriage and infertility creates empathy for anyone else who has lived the same. Being diagnosed with bipolar disorder softens the heart towards others suffering from mental illness. Living off noodles to make rent softens the heart towards the poor. There is an inherent solidarity in suffering that draws compassion to the surface." And finally, this: we must not try and find a shortcut from suffering. Satan's 3 temptations of Jesus, turning stones into bread, enlisting angels to rescue him, and worshipping Satan in exchange for regaining dominion over the fallen world, were all about shortcuts. Taste bread without tilling the soil, planting a seed, waiting. Win instant popularity through spectacle. Get your creation back without suffering. Become a king without ever becoming a servant. Wear a crown without ever carrying a cross. Why didn't Jesus take the shortcut? Because a victorious but unsuffering God is not good news. I think we need to learn to embrace the pain of suffering and find God in it. Often I find that in my suffering I lose words, I lose language to handle it. And often I found that the church often isn't very good at finding good language for lament. But I love it that the fact that Paul says that the Holy Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Holy Spirit intercedes with us with groans too deep for words. We need to learn to groan again. It's the language of the Spirit. We're coming to a close, and I realize this has been heavy stuff. And often I like to kind of finish my talks with some concrete takeaways. But tonight I don't particularly want to do that because this is a tricky topic, and I don't want to trivialize in any way at all the suffering, the struggle, the pain that each of us may have to handle. But I do want to give us a chance to learn to see what embracing suffering as a community looks like. So I want to give a bit of time and space tonight to embrace this topic, discuss it in groups, so that we can learn from each other and support each other as we go through this journey of suffering. If you're new, one of the things we love to do every now and then is just to break up into groups, smaller groups, so we can chew over the things we've been listening to and try and work out what it looks like in practice. So to enable that tonight, I've got 4 questions I'd love you to process in your groups and try and see if you can work out what this might look like for you in practice. So how do you typically respond to suffering, emotionally, spiritually, and relationally? And what role does your faith play in these responses, if at all? In what ways can suffering cause us to draw closer to God? How can we better handle those seasons of suffering when it seems as if God is absent? And how can we, as a community, support one another in suffering without offering shallow comfort or bypassing the pain? So I hope you enjoy processing those questions together. Let's spend maybe 10 to 15 minutes chewing this over, and then we'll come back together as we round up. You know, this is heavy stuff. This is where the rubber hits the road in terms of working out our faith. To find purpose in our suffering, to encounter God in our suffering, to find him when it feels as if he's gone missing in action. And I do believe, definitely, that God wants us to offer our suffering to him. He wants us to bring our suffering to him. He wants to invade our suffering so that we find his presence in the middle of our suffering, and that is enough. As we sing our final song, I just encourage you to present your own struggles and suffering to Jesus once again. And I'd love to offer prayer, as we love to do on these times together. If you're struggling with your suffering, you'd love someone to pray for you, just do come forward during the last song, and those who are able and ready to pray, if you can just make yourself available. And particularly, I'd love to pray tonight for those of you who feel that God's gone missing in action. He's AWOL. If that's your sense, then we'd love particularly, specifically tonight, to pray with you. Should we stand and we'll sing? If you want prayer, come as and when you're ready.